The youngest person in the United States to ever be put to death by the electric chair was an African-American 14-year-old named George Stinney Jr. His execution happened in 1944, in the midst of the Jim Crow era in the Deep South. George Stinney Jr. lived in the segregated mill town of Alcolu South, were separated by railroad tracks. Stinney's family lived in a humble company house until they were forced to leave after the young boy was accused of bludgeoning two white girls to death. It took a jury of white men and 10 minutes to find Stinney guilty, and it would take 70 years before Stinney was exonerated. In March of 1944, Betty June Pinaka, 11, and Mary Emma Timms, 7, were riding their bicycles in Alcolu looking for flowers. When they saw Stinney and his younger sister aim during their journey, they stopped and asked if they knew where to find maypops, the yellow edible fruit of passion flowers. That was reportedly the last time the girls were seen alive. Pinaka and Timms, who were white, never made it home that day. Their disappearance prompted hundreds of Alcolu residents, including Stinney's father, to come together and search for the missing girls. It wasn't until the next day when their dead bodies were discovered in a soggy ditch. When Dr. Asbury Cecil Bozzard examined their bodies, there was no clear sign of a struggle, but both girls had met violent ends with multiple blows to the heads. Timms had suffered a hole boring straight through her forehead into her skull, along with a 2-inch long cut above her right eyebrow. Meanwhile, Pinaka had suffered at least 7 blows to the head. It was later noted that the back of her skull was nothing but a mass of crushed bones. Bozzard concluded that Pinaka and Timms had wounds that were likely caused by a round instrument about the size of the head of a hammer. When Clarendon County law enforcement officers learned from a witness that Pinaka and Timms were seen talking to Stinney, they went to his home. There, George Stinney Jr. was handcuffed and later interrogated for hours in a small room without his parents, an attorney, or any witnesses. Police claimed that Stinney confessed to murdering Pinaka and Timms after his plan to have sex with one of the girls failed. An officer named H.S. Newman wrote in a handwritten statement, "I arrested a boy by the name of George Stinney. He then made a confession and told me where to find a piece of iron about 15 inches long. He said he put it in a ditch about 6 feet from the bicycle." As talk of lynching the child spread around the area, Newman refused to reveal where Stinney was detained. Not even his parents knew where he was as his trial approached. At the time, 14 was considered the age of responsibility. About a month after the murders, George Stinney Jr.'s trial began at the Clarendon County Courthouse, where court-appointed attorney Charles Plowden did little to nothing to defend his client. During the 2-hour trial, Plowden failed to call witnesses to the stand or present any evidence that would cast doubt on the prosecution's case. The most significant piece of evidence presented against Stinney was his alleged confession, but there was no written record of the teen admitting to the murders. By the time of his trial, Stinney hadn't seen his parents in weeks, and they were reportedly too afraid of getting attacked by a white mob to come to the courthouse. So the 14-year-old was surrounded by strangers, up to 1,500 of them. Following a deliberation that took less than 10 minutes, the all-white jury found Stinney guilty of murder, with no recommendation for mercy. On April 24, 1944, the teen was sentenced to die by electrocution. George Stinney Jr.'s execution was not without protest. In South Carolina, organizers for both white and black ministerial unions petitioned Governor Olin Johnston to grant Stinney clemency based on his young age. Meanwhile, hundreds of letters and telegrams poured into the governor's office, begging him to show mercy to Stinney. Stinney's supporters appealed with everything from the concept of fairness to the idea of Christian justice. But none of it was enough to save Stinney. On June 16, 1944, George Stinney Jr. walked into the execution chamber at the South Carolina State Penitentiary in Columbia with a Bible tucked under his arm. Weighing in at just 95 pounds, he was dressed in a loose-fitting striped jumpsuit. Strapped into an adult-size electric chair, he was so small that the state electrician struggled to adjust an electrode to his right leg. A mask that was too big for him was placed over his face. An assistant captain asked Stinney if he had any last words. Stinney replied, "No, sir." The prison doctor prodded, "You don't want to say anything about what you did?" Again, Stinney replied, "No, sir." When officials turned on the switch, 2,400 volts surged through Stinney's body, causing the mask to slip off. His eyes were white and teary, and saliva was emanating from his mouth for all the witnesses in the room to see. After 2 more jolts of electricity, it was over. Stinney was pronounced dead shortly thereafter. In a span of just 83 days, the boy had been charged with murder, tried, convicted, and executed by the state. George Stinney's first-degree murder conviction was thrown out in 2014. His siblings claimed that his confession was coerced and that he had an alibi. At the time of the murders, he was with his sister Amy, watching the family's cow. They also noted that a man named Wilford Johnny Hunter, who claimed to be Stinney's cellmate, said that Stinney denied murdering Pinaka and Thames. He said, "Johnny, why would they kill me for something I didn't do?" After months of consideration, on December 17, 2014, Judge Carmen T. Mullen vacated Stinney's murder conviction, calling it a great and fundamental injustice. George Stinney Jr.'s siblings were overjoyed to learn that their brother was exonerated after 70 years, appreciating that they were able to live long enough to see it happen.